All right, so let's jump right into it then.
Yes, there
So
you go.
maybe just to get it going. So Craig, we got Fred on the line as well.
Hello.
All right, so just a recap, right? So online we had this conversation. It started with Hunter's post. So Hunter, in a quick few minutes, can you kind of highlight what you were talking about there?
Yeah, so the idea is that Exchange admins are kind of in this unique position to be the leaders in this transition of Office 365 because they traditionally, more organizations have email services. They've adopted more of email services. Email is this kind of ubiquitous thing that everybody uses, right? And as we know, Exchange admins frequently have a little bit going on with Active Directory. If there's a SharePoint environment with the sharing and everything that goes on there, especially with like security and distribution groups, they've got a little bit of a hand in like SharePoint and the OneDrives and everything that's happening in the organization. And so, and traditionally, there's been this heavy importance placed on Exchange, and like a lot of customers I talk to, the Exchange admins are the AD admins because they're the only ones that really understand everything that's going on with it, right? And so, yeah, so the point is that they're in this unique position to kind of take the lead in these organizations where you see a lot of chaos happening in the IT department where roles aren't clearly defined. And if, let's say, the IT manager or the CIO isn't really organizing things, right? We talk to so many IT teams and there's just chaos. And so what I wrote is that they're in this unique position to kind of stand up, take the lead, and help organize things because they see a little bit more of all the services that are happening there.
So we're talking about post deployment here, right? We're not talking about
Mhm.
who should migrate, who should deploy. We're saying, companies are already using this, but who should be that chokeable neck who's taking the lead, making the calls, making decisions. For me, while I see where you're coming from, Hunter, but for me, I think it should be that SharePoint admin or whoever that SharePoint lead is, should be the Office 365 lead as well. I'm not saying they don't work with the other teams. They have to work with the Exchange folks, the AD, security folks. But if a hard decision has to be made, for example, how do we turn on group self service or not, or other platform wide decision from a technical perspective, I think SharePoint folks should be taking the lead. Fred, Craig, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, to that point with regards to permissions wise, this is one of the key things with regard SharePoint and Exchange. Uh, I'm with experience that permissions is going to be messy if you don't necessarily have that governance, and it might be different between Exchange and SharePoint. But information architecture wise, it is closer to SharePoint when you're trying to do governance on permissions.
So, what's your vote then, Fred? Who should be taking the lead from an operational perspective?
Well, qualities wise, as I mentioned, the SharePoint guy has that closer to the end user, being able to specify what permissions do we need to structure the sites or the site collections and all that. Right?
Got it. Craig, thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of have to agree with you. I thought we were well. I get where Hunter's coming from, but yeah. So like every implementation that I've done started out with AD and Exchange because that's what people want to get up there first, and they need to get all that identity management and that kind of stuff. But really, once it gets up there and gets started running with those, I haven't seen a whole lot of need to maintain that over the time. So then you get SharePoint comes in and we start setting up the SharePoint and the OneDrive and the Teams and all that gets driven. Um, but I'm going to go slightly. I don't know if that's IT, so to speak, because once that's set up, who should be handling that, right? Because you start talking more architectural and strategy, and then going into governance. Is that an IT person? Is that an IT? I mean, I don't think it's a typical IT pro, right?
Yeah,
It's
because
it's a
the
different skill
problem
set there.
Yeah, the problem today is there's no well-defined role for an Office 365 admin, right? So
Right.
I
That's
think
the
that
whole
will
deal.
come. I think through time that will come. But
Yeah.
today, Office 365 as a platform, good or bad, you got to know a lot, right? In the case I'm making is, for SharePoint
Yeah, I agree. It's got to
will
come
be
out of that
closest.
SharePoint grab background, but I'm not necessarily thinking that it needs to be the SharePoint IT pro. Um,
Hmm.
well,
Interesting.
and I come from a different background, right? Because when I was coming up, it was here's your farm, you go with it. So, I was the IT pro slash developer slash architect slash everything our organization for a long time was doing with SharePoint. So yeah, that would have been me moving to Office 365. But a lot of guys, it's they know how to stand up the server and do that kind of stuff. But other than that, you're really
So
it's a
in
different.
order, I mean, I agree with you. Ideally, there should be like a committee, a governance body. Realistically, customers we talk to, that whole concept is just so foreign, right? They're trying to get stuff going. And we like it or not, Microsoft keeps introducing new stuff, right? Groups was introduced, only 3 years ago. So at that time, and even to this day, who owns groups? It's the AD people, right? And while they look at it from a lens of membership, security membership, all that, to Fred's point earlier, then what about those permission level stuff? Like all these workloads get created. You create a team, it's an owner and a member, but the team creates a SharePoint site collection where permissions is a mess. So who makes that technical call if you lack that body, right? That governance, that committee. I mean, yeah, CIO writes a check, business level, but who makes that technical call?
Well, and I think that's the response from the community is like, make that body, like make it, do it now, and that's one of the things that we talk about here in AvePoint is like, look, there is chaos. There's all this stuff happening. And I can say, look, yeah, Exchange admins should pop up and take control of this, or maybe Active Directory admins or SharePoint admins, whoever we're talking about here. Or like to Craig's point, maybe it's somebody that has a little bit more in-depth knowledge of the solution itself and not a traditional admin, as it were. But the point is overall, right, that they need to work together. Whoever's in the IT department, there needs to be a plan. And that needs to be one of the very first thing that happens, because you shouldn't have this scenario where somebody has to step up and call for that. But I feel like that's what's being
I have seen for bigger organizations a more of a starting to roll out, like the Office 365 platform team lead, right? So it's not a person, it's a guy who's in charge of the different admins or the different people who will be working on the site. So that is encouraging, but that's going to be a slow process.
So hey, Bruno, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Can you hear us?
Hey guys, how are you doing?
So the conversation is Office 365 is set up and running. There's different groups, and we all agree, we should work together. But at the end of the day, who should make that technical call if there's issues that arise, or who should make that technical judgment? Which traditional background should be the Exchange admin, the SharePoint admin, AD? Who would that be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that and I actually reviewed the thread earlier, right, and that escalated actually very quickly. I was surprised to see. But in general, there definitely, and I think there was some consensus around, the Office 365 understands the bits and pieces and kind of how they're put together from an architectural standpoint, right? Also, somebody who definitely has the end user colleague's best interest in mind, right? So, one of the things that sometimes we miss as technologists really is that piece of like, hey, we're building this for other people to use, right? And many times we kind of miss that, and we kind of want things to go our way, whether it's, the messaging guys that want to do X, or the AD guys that only want to do Y, for example. And there should be somebody that also has the voice of the end users, because ultimately that is what we're building it for. The Office 365 ecosystem is really around collaboration for end users to be able to do their job better, faster, in a more agile experience. And in the end of it all, I remember saying that, we don't ask this kind of stuff of other teams, right? Like when we bring in something like Jira and Confluence into the mix, right? We don't ask like, hey, does the AD guy want to take that? Does the Exchange guy want to take that? It's more like, hey, let's build a team around that. And then there is an overall person that will kind of make that final decision of like, yes, do you have groups that you can have anybody create, or have it more locked down, for example? So, those are kind of my 2 cents around who goes where and what goes what.
So you bring up a good point, Bruno. Like in other platforms, forget Office, like SAP, Jira, whatever. It seems like it's not, unless I haven't been exposed to that as much, it's not as big of an issue. Whereas what we're seeing here, especially working with customers, like once they deployed it, right, it's either one group wants to own it and they don't have full knowledge or full background, or nobody wants to own it. again, perfect world, we should have like a committee, an Office 365 admin,
Yeah.
but we're not there yet.
And
That's
that's one of the challenges, right, with the old versus new, right? I mean, we've all been working under the Microsoft stack for years, right? And it's all been, if you worked for smaller organizations, you may have had leadership around a few different parts, right? Where sometimes you find that there's always an AD guy that always does DNS and DHCP and these other types of network services, and there's always like an email guy who kind of
Yep.
always handle that because email is the one thing that you'll have your head cut off if it's not running, right? But now where we're, this is kind of the first, I would say, foray into the Microsoft world, having that DevOps agile approach, right? Where I think there just hasn't been a lot of that exposure for folks who've been dealing within the Microsoft stacks, in the different pieces, and Office 365 kind of brings that all together, and everybody's like, well, where's my piece? Where's my thing? What do I give up, kind of thing, And we hear all the time around that retool and, rebrand for folks and things like that. And the ones who embrace it kind of get it. And there's always those that you've got to pull from behind, kind of thing of like, it's going to be okay. You're going to do well. You're going to kind of retool and rebrand as, more of a business guy who also does the email piece.
But it's also, it's not just people asking like, what's my piece of the pie, right? One of the reasons, like, and something I see a lot with like the MVP community and the Microsoft community and all these things, there's so many people, they have to reach out into the void to figure out what's going on and to stay atop of what's coming new, because it's just as much, hey, what's my actual responsibility as like, you talk to a customer and ask them a couple of questions about some features or security aspects of Office 365, and they're like, what? Like, none of us knew about that. Whoa, there's this thing. And then suddenly they find there's this massive gap in the plan that they've had. And, there's catch up that has to come after that, right?
So Fred, how is your team set up? So can you give us an idea?
So we're divided into an applications group and an operations group. Operations, as Craig mentioned, handles kind of the setup of the transit migration between on-prem to an Office 365, Microsoft 365 platform. And then I work together with a network admin or a network director that would, after that transition, hey, this system is ready, then take it from there, right? It's pretty much more where now you are able to get the house going. Who's going to be doing the interior design afterwards, right?
Got it. So does your team take care of things like, do we turn on self-service or not? Or when a new features or a new workload is introduced, like, do we enable flow for everybody? Stuff like that.
Well, and that's what I'm driving right now is more on which particular functionalities or apps or features do we use within the Office 365 stack. Typically, it would be I would work with their director, the guy that heads up the operations team, and say, hey, we could use this and that for that particular business case or use case. And so I'm the one driving with the IT director, saying that these are some of the functionalities that we can take advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's another kind of ball of wax that affects these implementations and the responsibilities around Office 365, and that is that now with all these different applications, there's a new understanding of what security means, right? Because traditionally, most organizations really focus on that authentication and like user level security or network security. But the concept and the importance of content level security, like who has access to specific collaboration spaces, we talk about this in the Office 365 world, like all the MVPs. This is what we do. We talk about this stuff all day long, right? But overall, for the IT industry as a whole, telling traditional IT people like, hey, you've got to worry about this SharePoint site, right? And the content in this document library. That's like a whole new thing that organizations aren't totally set up to deal with. And people that are traditionally familiar with SharePoint, right, and OneDrive and also Exchange, much more understanding of these things. and it kind of enters into the conversation. But for organizations that haven't had, or on their IT team, maybe they don't have professionals that are so familiar with that, and they're making this transition to Office 365. That's like everything in Office 365, just like you guys are saying, right? That Exchange authentication and the Active Directory stuff, you get all that stuff set up, and we started our conversation on talking about this. Once you get that set up, there's not so much maintenance anymore on all of that. It becomes about like, who has access to this document? Why are we using this SharePoint site? What's this team for, right? And that's like, it creates this whole new IT communication dynamic.
And that's the maturity, right? That's the maturity of the platform, and how then the roles kind of shift and change a little bit, and how the teams grow, and how folks who have been traditionally either AD focused or Exchange focused now can grow into other roles as well, right? Where Office 365 is really making a lot of these things just kind of like the light switch. Hey, you need an email set up, you buy an Office 365 license, you fill out a couple of fields, have a nice day. You don't really have to worry about like the pipes getting put together, right? It's the same way that I talk a little bit about developers. Developers nowadays can probably do 75 to 80% of the work that it takes to get an infrastructure up and running for them to run their product. While that's incredibly dangerous, at least it can be done, right? We can still remember the days of just like developers had no clue when they needed Active Directory for and why and this, that, and the other. We can still remember those days. And today, it's all fairly easily, and that then goes back to saying, hey, the Exchange folks that have also migrated to do some SharePoint work, can now start to kind of take on that security role a piece, right? Because you're no longer managing how you make distribution lists. You're no longer managing, and as long as you're out of that whole hybrid environment piece, right? As long as you're natively in 365, they can now start to kind of like retool. They just want to have to do that. And that's where sometimes when I mentioned in my post as well about somebody who can keep a little bit of the egos in check, right? Where it's like, hey, we all have that niche play that we want to play, all of those years of experience that we've had, and sometimes we're just uncomfortable on taking on these new things of just like, hey, you know what, securing that content in that team, for example, to make sure that only these 5 people can see it, just kind of isn't really my thing, right? But it's like, you're also not doing much more on the Exchange side of the house. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's either you either kind of grow with the platform, right? Or unfortunately, sometimes you kind of grow out of the job a little bit. So we just all have to be careful. It is a very complex situation still, even today, in kind of doing that.
No, this is good. Now, in the interest of time, I just want to be respectful of everybody's time. So, closing remarks, right? If you can provide guidance or advice to folks out there listening, or to customers out there based on your experience, who would you recommend? And realistically, right, short of hiring more people or forming a group, with the resources they have, who would you recommend, and how can they best manage, maintain, and grow their platform? So maybe I'll have you get started, Fred.
Yeah, so mine, to Bruno's point a while ago, where it's a matter of who has control and all that, right? One challenge that we have right now actually is more on AD has that control portion of creating AD groups, security groups. That's the best practice before on SharePoint. But now you're trying to push that and empower users to create their own teams, rather than creating AD groups. Teams is more on users manage your own, owners manage your own members. And so that is more a SharePoint guy background could give them guidance on those kinds of things, where, hey, this is how you could do it in a best practice way, because this is how you could manage teams much better.
Awesome. Craig?
Okay, I'm going to do one little side thing here, because I think a couple things came up that, like licensing and knowing the licensings with all these new features and stuff, that in and of itself is a whole different discussion, but I just want to throw that out for a future thing. What I see is again, I'd like to see somebody with a SharePoint background, because I feel once it's implemented, a lot of that with teams and managing and the governance and the permissions comes better and naturally for somebody who's had that SharePoint experience. But I'm going to go back. I'm going to go a different route and fall back and say, I want to find my guy who I have currently working for me that loves to learn, because the Office 365 platform is changing so fast and so much is coming out. So much is new. It's really hard to stay on top of it. So if I got an AD admin that just loves to learn new things and wants to get involved and pick up the rest of Office 365, whether that's the Skype guy who now, needs to get the communications part and the Teams part, it really, you got to look at your team and just saying who's the person that's going to step up and learn the most and be able to work together with the business to figure out the problems. And ideally, because I come from SharePoint background, that typically is where I've seen that come out of. But there could be any different places.
Cool. Bruno, advice, thoughts?
You know what? I'm gonna +1 for Craig. Actually, I'm always a guy who likes to hire from within. So if there is somebody who can certainly, where you can see, promise that he can be a good business leader, right? That they
He or
are
she,
trying
right?
to
Yeah.
get out. Yeah, no, absolutely. That they can try to get out of that purely technical role and really kind of deep dive and care around the platform itself and ultimately those that are using it, right? Because a lot of it comes down to how folks use it, and what's the impact to them to begin with to open up these new features and things like that. I would certainly look for somebody from within, regardless of whether they were, the SharePoint guy, the Exchange guy, whoever. It's really who wants to continue to learn and move forward in that. So I'm going to +1 that for Craig, absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, thank you.
What about you, Hunter? Did we change your mind, or you're still?
I think on the whole, just because I think that a lot of good points are made here, and I don't think in every situation that everybody's just wrong, right? But I think on the whole, from all the customers I talk to and everything I see, there's so little deep adoption of what SharePoint has going on, and there's so much around like the chats and Teams and just email communication going on in Office 365. I still stand by what I said, that the Exchange admins are in this unique position and have a lot of knowledge to bring to the table. But I will +1 the point that person that's a learner that can pop into things, I mean, that is huge. And I think that's an amazing point, that like, if there's someone that's enthusiastic that can stay on top of this stuff and learn the new things, that is somebody to invest in. And also, the other point I'll add to my point, or any of our points, is that if you've got someone on your team that's poison and they're trying to take control of your IT department, or they're creating conflict, and the point that was made earlier from all of us, right? Like, pay attention to your end users. Are they helping the business work more productively? Are they paying attention to the use cases and the business cases that the users need, right? If those people aren't paying attention to all of that and they're not working nice on a team, I'd say that fast learning and able to work well on a team are probably two of the most valued qualities over even experience to a certain degree for all of this stuff. I think that those are excellent points. And I would echo that the ideal situation, and this is what the community seems overall to be feeding back, ideally, you don't have to worry about this. Ideally, your IT team works together. Ideally, they are team members and responsibilities are clear and chopped up, and they can say, look, you do this, you do that, you do that. And you have one or two enthusiastic people that are staying on top of the new stuff that are informing everybody, right? That's the ideal situation. But yeah, I guess that's what I got to say. Yeah.
All right, gang. Thanks so much. So I assume I'm recording this. Okay for you guys if I post this, like bits and pieces?
Sure.
Good?
Yeah.
All right.
Home. Thanks for putting this together. This is great.
For sure. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Have a good
guys.
day.
See you, Doug.
Take care, y'all.